So I grew up in kind of a lower income family. My grandfather, he helped pay for my college by flipping houses. He was an entrepreneur himself, but he did some house flipping on the side. And it just started to click of like, my grandpa did this house. He made money off that. That went to help pay for my college. So it was just one of these things that I was exposed to, but didn't really click until later in life.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Freedom Blueprint. I am Adrienne Green, and today we're here with Ali Swart. Get ready for insights to help you scale, systemize, and create more freedom. Let's jump in. So, Ali, thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And Ali is a friend of mine, and I'm really excited because she has a great financial background that she brings to her real estate investing because Ali's been a practicing certified financial planner for nearly 16 years and an investor herself for over 18 years. Now, Ali will get into this, but she grew up in a lower income family and she learned the importance of financial stability and was always fascinated with the process of earning money and growing wealth. She began investing in the stock market and she's expanded into other areas, including private money lending, which we'll get into a lot today, multifamily private equity, and cryptocurrencies. While being a certified financial planner is Ali's career, her most important title in life is mom to her 7-year-old son and 5-year-old daughter. So I'm really excited for us to discuss more about you and have you share your wisdom with us, Ali.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Adrienne. I'm really excited about this conversation, and I kind of geek out at all things investing, as my bio kind of said, with stock market and real estate. And a lot of people have talked about crypto over the past couple of years just by nature of its exposure and all of those things. So I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. And can you tell me about your start in real estate investing and what inspired you to get started?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'll go back a little bit because so I grew up in kind of a lower income family. My parents both had good, stable jobs, but they were just kind of lower income. My mom was a dental assistant, still is a dental assistant. And then my dad was a general contractor. And you would think, oh, general contractor, real estate, like booming business, right? But I'm sure you have a lot of business owners that listen to this podcast. And while my dad was great at his trade, he was kind of a terrible business owner, right? He didn't master the
Mhm.
customer service. He didn't master the operations of having a business. And so ultimately, the business was not horribly successful, even though he was very good at his craft. So I would say my first foray into exposure to real estate was just seeing my dad and his general contracting practice. He did everything from roofing to siding to windows, doing things, our home as a kid, because our home was built in 1890 that I
Oh,
grew up
wow.
in as a kid, so a very old house. I remember seeing the basic things like a fuse box and a sandstone foundation and like all of those things that you see in a really old house when you're living right on the border of Ohio and West Virginia. And then another foray that I just remember being exposed to when I was younger was my grandfather helped pay for my college, and he helped pay for my college by flipping houses. He was an entrepreneur himself, but he did some house flipping on the side. And it just started to click of like, my grandpa did this house. He made money off that. That went to help pay for my college. So it was just one of these things that I was exposed to, but didn't really click until later in life. I really got my start with investing through the stock market. I started investing in the stock market in my late teens and my early 20s because candidly, I had a little bit of money left over from my student loans. And so I took some leftover money from my student loans and thought, oh, I could do some arbitrage of putting this into the stock market. And my student loan was X amount. Maybe I could make more than that. And that was really
Mhm.
my first foray into overall investing. And then throughout my 20s, I was lucky to get on with a company very early on in my career that did a 7% 401k match and then a 10% profit sharing. So with my 7%, the 7% match and then the 10% profit sharing, there was essentially 24% of my income that was going into the stock market. And so it just made me very aware of how all of that worked. And then with getting into actual real estate investing for ourselves, throughout my 20s, my husband and I, we kind of built our wealth mainly through the stock market. But it got to a point where I was doing our net worth statement one year and said, wow, it's time to diversify. Like we've done a great job adding to this part of our wealth. And so
Mhm.
At that point, we knew we wanted to diversify, and real estate was a natural asset class that we knew we needed exposure to and wanted exposure to. And so we started to ask ourselves, how do we get that real estate exposure? And so we started down that path. And I truly believed at that time that we wanted to be long term multifamily residential real estate investors at that time. That was
Mhm.
my thesis at the time. And so I started looking at smaller units, duplexes, triplexes, quads. We live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania now, so I kind of started with the Pittsburgh market. And for national investors out there, Pittsburgh is probably known as one of the more affordable markets in terms
Mhm.
of price anyway. So I started looking at those smaller multi-units, and we started doing all the things, right? Doing all the due diligence, putting in offers, spending a significant amount of time underwriting these deals. And
Yeah.
about 6 months into that process, my husband came to me and he was like, "Ali, I do not know how you think we are going to landlord and be two full-time working professionals with two young kids."
Right.
Because at that time our kids were 3 and 5. And I said, fair point. Fair point. We are doing a lot of man hours and some sweat equity on a lot of due diligence and not coming up with anything. And
Hmm.
so at that point, we ended up pivoting and we ended up going into private money lending and looking at syndications or private equity. And so what we ended up doing was starting to do the private money lending journey. And then we ended up doing a relationship with a private equity firm here that does long-term multifamily residential real estate. So we kept with the thesis, but we found an operator to do that for us
Right.
instead. And I know I just talked for 5 minutes straight there, so I'll let you ask questions, Adrienne.
Well, I love so much of what you shared, and one of the things that I want to highlight, and you may have more on, is so often people feel like it's like the stock market and real estate are like going head to head and battling, and that one has to be better than the other. And I love how you realize it's about diversification and doing both. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that, or if you've run into that kind of like people want to pit them against each other.
Yeah, and I have a biased view, right? I'm a certified financial planner. Working in the public equity space is very much a lot of what we do, along with the financial planning. But we know that the private markets have their place too. And probably what got me really interested in the stock market, even before I became a certified financial planner, was these little hints that I experienced as a kid. Growing up, my grandfather was really important to me, the one that helped me pay for college. And one of the things he started pounding into my head pretty early on was that my dad was a very, very intelligent guy. He went through WVU in 3 years, very smart guy, did 4 years of college in 3 years. And he did business. And my grandpa kept telling him, you need to go be a stockbroker, right? And a stockbroker was a thing, right? Like in the 80s, you know. I remember my grandpa telling me stories about how my dad had so much potential and he should have been a stockbroker and he didn't go do it because he didn't want to wear a suit and tie, right? If you remember back to my opening, like my dad became a general contractor, like they don't
Right.
wear suit and ties. But just
Hmm.
those little things that I think we pick up as kids start to ingrain
Oh
something in
yeah.
you. And those little stories that my grandpa used to tell me about how my dad should have been a stockbroker implanted in me somehow. And I think somehow along the lines, he probably implanted something in most of the grandchildren because I'm a certified financial planner. My other cousin is an attorney. I have another cousin that's a pharmacist. So we have a bunch of really accomplished women in our family, but a lot of those things came from stories that, my grandparents would tell me, and my grandmother used to sit me down and make me run the QuickBooks in their business. She had an accounting background and she would make me sit down and run the QuickBooks. So things like just accounting and finance and all of those things were ingrained in me. But to
Hmm.
your original question, it came down to diversification and what do we need to have a really successful portfolio. And in my 16 years of being a practicing CFP, we see a lot of real estate investors, right? We see a lot of real estate investors, we see a lot of business owners who have a lot of their net worth that is tied up in an illiquid format. And liquidity is always a benefit somehow. And how you might get that benefit of liquidity might be through the stock market, it might be through the bond market, it might be through pure cash, right? But having some form of liquidity is a benefit to any investor. And so I don't necessarily look at the stock market versus real estate. I look at liquidity versus illiquidity and how those things tie in to our overall net worth. And I look at the variation of returns. Something that I also wanted to build into our net worth, because when I was looking at our net worth and we knew we decided we needed to add real estate to our portfolio, it was for a little bit more stability and predictability of returns, because we all know the stock market goes like this, right? It's up, it's
Right.
down. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's bloody brutal. And by adding in the private money lending and by adding in the private equity that we did to our portfolio, it was meant to have a more steady return. And I know we're going to get more into the private money lending space, but when you're looking at lending anywhere between probably 11 and 15%, give or take, on the deal, that provides a more stable foundation for your overall portfolio when you've got the stock market that's kind of going to go like this.
Great. I love that viewpoint on it. Now, when you decided, and you and your husband decided, hey, we probably don't want the active landlording side of things. Let's look at passive things. How did you land on the two that you did with the private money lending and the private equity? How did those two
Yeah.
come out as the winners of, there are several passive options?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it really came down to how can we use some of the wealth that we have created and be passive with what we're about to do. Because unlike a lot of real estate investors, I wasn't necessarily looking to replace my income. I wasn't looking to replace my income or leave my W-2. I love being a certified financial planner. So for me, it was about how do we add a little bit more stability to our overall portfolio? And a light bulb clicked, and maybe it was serendipitous timing. I was actually reading two books at the same time. One was The Hands-Off Investor, which is a really big deep dive into syndications and how you vet operators and how an investor should be looking at hands-off real estate. So I was reading that book for the real estate side of it. And then just for personal development, I was also reading the book Who Not How. And it just clicked when we first started going into real estate and we thought we were going to be hands-on investors. I kept asking myself, how? How am I going to do this? How am I going to find a deal? How am I going to build a team? How am I? How am I?
Hmm.
And the Who Not How book changed my perspective of I need a who in this part of my life, right? We can often be the how in certain aspects of our life, but for this part of our investing journey, I decided I don't need to be the person. I need a who for this. And so when I started saying, okay, well, I need a who, then I started going out to my network. I started with my network of what operators do I already know? How can I find operators? Who should I be looking at? And so that book, The Hands Off Investor, gave me a really solid foundation on how to think about an operator and who to look for. And then with the private money lending, it was along the same aspect. The actual first private money loan that I did was actually through my self-directed IRA. I mentioned early on in the episode that I had the blessing of having the 7% 401k, 7% match, 10% profit sharing. I had since left that job and switched jobs. And so I had this, pretty significant bucket of retirement money. And so I asked myself, I've got this big chunk in the stock market, right? Why don't I shift some of that over to my real estate goals? And so we took a portion of my traditional IRA and put it into a self-directed IRA, and that was our first foray into private money lending.
I love it. And as someone who also uses a self-directed IRA, I think that's something I need to have a whole episode about that because that can be so powerful. And what I love about it for private money lending, and maybe you can get into this more with your background, is the tax advantages. Because the one downside I find of private money lending is it's taxed as ordinary income if you're doing it outside of a retirement account. But when you do it inside of a retirement account, that tax implication doesn't matter. Was that
Yes.
like a big reason for you, or do you want to share on that a little bit?
Yeah, so getting into private money lending was definitely twofold. Number one, I knew I wanted the real estate exposure, and some may argue that private money lending is not necessarily real estate exposure, but I consider it real estate exposure because the people that I am lending to are primarily flippers. The deals that
Hmm.
we have done are primarily flips. You can private money lend on all different types of deals, but to me, that helps to satisfy the real estate exposure. It also helped to satisfy a more consistent return to complement the variability in my stock market returns. So going with the self-directed IRA made natural sense there. And it was where my money was, right? I will say, I don't want to call it a mistake, but if I could go back into my 20s, I would have tried to build up more of a taxable brokerage base because I definitely did, quote unquote, the right things in my 20s by trying to max out my K plans and really saving into retirement accounts. But as I got towards the end of my 20s and into my early 30s, I found myself with these giant retirement accounts saying, like, holy cow, I need to not only diversify my savings, I need to diversify the investments that I am in. So I don't want to say it was a mistake because we did a great job saving, but I wish I had had more diversity of savings throughout my 20s. So it was just a natural way to go into the self-directed IRA to accomplish the things that I set out to do. To be clear, we do private money lending with both, right? We use a self-directed IRA and we use taxable funds now, but my first foray was with the self-directed IRA.
Feeling overwhelmed managing your rental portfolio? What if you could run it like a business and free up your time? My one-on-one coaching program helps investors like you build systems at scale so you can grow without the chaos. Book a free strategy session today at adriennegreen.com/coaching. You'll find the link in the show notes. Awesome. And why did you not just invest in a syndication? Why did you decide to do the private money lending instead of just, hey, I'm going to be an LP in a syndication and just give them my funds?
Yeah, and so we ended up doing both, right? So the first thing that we did was the private money lending. The first one that we did was a 12-month deal, right? So it was shorter term, quote unquote, shorter term. It was a 12-month deal. I was happy with that. And about 5 months later, once we had done the private money lending, we did invest into a private equity firm that does the multifamily residential real estate. And I view that as a longer term aspect of our portfolio because the particular fund that we invested into is an opportunistic fund that was looking to take advantage of dislocations in the multifamily market with interest rates in particular. We invested into this when interest rates had started rising. And so you're bound to eventually find owners who are kind of in a pinch and they're wanting to offload their properties because they can't refi out or they've just gotten to the point where they're ready to sell, right? So the operator that we chose, it aligned with our investment thesis. And what I meant by that is it was multifamily residential. It was in what the operator calls the heartland of the US. So it's Western New York, Pittsburgh, West Virginia, Cleveland, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, Indianapolis, I think parts of Western Kentucky. So you were looking at a market where they really target workforce housing instead of going to some of the more Sunbelt states or the warmer states where valuations on real estate had really, really ballooned over time. So it kind of fit our investment thesis. And I looked at that as a longer term investment because they were very clear that they were buying value added properties. And so they were clear that there would be no distributions for the first 2 years during the acquisition phase because they were acquiring, they were renovating, they were getting tenants back in that they had displaced. And so the whole fund was definitely set up as a 5 to 7 year play with the entirety of the fund and certainly no distributions for the first 2 years. So they were kind of two different thought processes there. The private money lending was more 12 months, set interest rate, I know what I'm going to get. And then with investing in the private equity real estate fund, it was more longer term, a longer play on real estate as part of our overall portfolio.
I love it. And I love how you have it all balanced there. Now, let's dive into like the private money lending a little bit there. Like, are
Yeah.
you finding these deals yourself? Are you like working with the borrowers coming to you? Are you doing the due diligence? Like, what does that look like for how you're doing the private money lending to make sure that, it all comes out, that it all works how it's supposed to, and that you get the money that you want? And how active is that for you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because before I did my first deal, when I decided this was a path we were going to explore, I honestly thought, how am I going to keep my money moving? Right? Because being a private money lender, it's only as good as how often you're keeping that money moving. And so
Mm-hmm.
I will answer your question, but I had kind of two different thought processes with the self-directed IRA and then my taxable funds. So with my self-directed IRA, I was more than happy to do a 12-month deal because I don't want to have to keep finding borrowers to keep IRA money moving because that is part of our long-term portfolio. I'm not using that money. I'm in my 30s. It's just there for long-term investing. So I was totally happy to go with a 12-month deal in my self-directed IRA, which I was able to find through a networking group. I think everybody has the old adage, your network is your net worth, right? So every single private money lending deal that we have done has been found through two of the networking groups that I'm a part of. So we found the self-directed IRA deal through one of the networking groups. And then I took a slightly different approach to start with my taxable funds because I kind of wanted a little bit quicker turnaround on my taxable funds to get my feet wet with it. And so the first two private money loans that I did with my taxable funds were both less than 35 days. I mean, they were
Oh,
quick
wow.
turnarounds. One deal was just an auction. So the borrower needed the money. They were buying a property at auction, so they had to go with cash. And they had a very good relationship with a local community bank to where pretty much as soon as they got that auction, they did a very light rehab. We're talking like 2, 3 weeks on a very light cleanup. Like it was a good looking property otherwise. It just was an auction property. And so they had a great relationship with local community banks. So they were able to refi me out because they wanted to keep the property for a burr. They refied me out and we were done, I think, in like 33 days. It was a really
Wow.
quick turnaround. And then on the second private money loan that I did with my taxable funds, I think we were out in 31 days because, again, experienced borrower who acquired the property, they ended up wholesaling it. And so it was a very quick process there. That got me comfortable with the process. And I was in first position liens on both of those properties. So you go in first position lien. That was important to me. And then as we got comfortable with the process, because I think anytime, I don't think enough people talk about this, I think the first time you send a stranger 6 figures of your own money, you're like, I really hope I know what I'm doing here because I literally sent a stranger 6 figures of my own money. And granted, you meet them through networking, like you kind of know them, but it's still when you go to hit that send wire on your banking app, it's like that money's gone. And you just hope you hope you put the processes in place. But yeah, first lien, personal guarantees, promissory notes, deed of trust, all of that fun stuff were involved on all of these deals. And so the first couple of deals were very, very quick. And then the deal that I'm in right now was a longer term play. So we actually structured the deal that I'm in right now. It would be a certain interest rate for the first 6 months. And if the flip went longer than 6 months, there was an escalation in the interest
Yeah.
rate past 6 months. So it's one
Hmm.
of those things where you kind of give the borrower incentive to get your money back in a quicker fashion. But if it stays out longer, your interest rate goes up and you just make a little bit more money. So I've been in that particular deal a little over 6 months, and the property is set to hit the market in the next 2 weeks or so, and then maybe give it 30 to 45 days to sell and close. That'll probably be closer to an 8, maybe 9 month deal.
Awesome. Wow. Yes, all of that. Thank you for sharing all those details that you did. I think that's really helpful. Now, one of the, I guess, the trends I've seen as you've gone through this is the level of, I guess, care you put into your finances, right? Like you said, this kind of all started when you were calculating your net worth, right? That seems like it's a routine thing for you to do. And then
Yeah.
you mentioned as, during the initial multifamily house hunt, your husband came to you and you guys collaborated. You guys were together on this, right? And that communication was a part of it. And then you talked about your investment thesis. Like all of these, I think, are little signs of like the systems and the organization and the thought you have behind the scenes kind of
Yeah.
guiding everything. So I'm wondering, if somebody doesn't have that yet, what would you share with them? What wisdom would you have to help create that backbone of diligence that's helped you do what you've done?
So there are several systems that I personally use, and tracking your net worth and especially putting it out on paper. And when I say paper, I mean I use an Excel spreadsheet. I'm not literally meaning pen and paper. But I know a lot of people use apps and other technology tools to track their net worth. And if that works for them, totally fine. But we use an Excel spreadsheet to lay out our net worth, and how we set it up is we use our liquid investments at the top, And then we have our harder assets like real estate, like the private money notes, all of that stuff kind of in the middle. And then we have any liabilities at the bottom of the sheet. And so it sort of gets your mind going of here's my liquidity, AKA for us, our stock market exposure. And then here's our real estate exposure or our illiquid assets, and then our liabilities. And when I really looked at our net worth, when I had that aha moment, it was really top heavy into the stock market and the liquidity. And just seeing that number in front of my face was an aha of like, okay, this makes sense to change. And so I would really encourage anybody to be able to use those tools and not only just use it to track, because I think a lot of people start by tracking and you want to see the numbers go up, of course, but how are you making decisions through looking at your net worth statement about your allocation and where you should be deploying funds? A big
Hmm.
question that I get just as a CFP is what should I be doing with my savings? And that's where with my own investing, I come back to a net worth statement and say, where do I want to add or where should I be adding? And I think combined with that, we didn't really talk about it much, but I employ zero-based budgeting. So I'm a big believer in bucketing systems of, my paycheck gets deposited and then we have a fixed operating budget where all of our fixed expenses come from. You're talking our mortgage, our utilities, daycare, insurances, like all of the fixed expenses come out of this operating account. And then I move our remaining cash into our investment vehicles. And then the only thing that actually stays in my checking account is the money that I am allowed, quote unquote, allowed to spend. And that was a huge game changer for me. I started doing zero-based budgeting almost 15 years ago. And it just really helped me by separating out the money into different accounts and being able to look at my checking account and say, Ali, this is what you can spend. And that was instrumental in my 20s when I wasn't making much money. Like there were months
Hmm.
where I knew I was going to be net negative in my early 20s when you're, student debt laden and you've got a car payment and all of these other things and you can look at that and be like, how am I going to fix that? But now, in my late 30s, it's how are we saving for retirement? How are we saving in taxable funds? How are we saving for our children? How are we creating sinking funds for vacations? How are we doing tax holdbacks for this private money lending that we're doing? Like all of that is bucketed
Hmm.
out in the zero-based budgeting approach. So really dialing that in was instrumental to the process. And then, yeah, but I think talking with your partner is vital, right? Like, I mean, you're married. This is the person that you're doing life with. And I don't have these statistics off the top of my head, but I know that finances are the number one documented stressor for Americans and especially in marriages. So I think being on the same page with your partner about how you are earning, saving, spending, and investing is just really important, not only for your wealth, but for your marriage as well.
Definitely. So much wisdom there. This has been amazing. We're at the 30-minute mark. Let's go
Yeah.
ahead and hop into the closing questions that we have for every guest. So, first, what is a transformational system that you've implemented in your real estate investing business?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on these, but the zero-based budgeting was absolutely amazing, not only for real estate, but for all of our investing journey. And then using the net worth not only as just a tracker, but as a tool for informed decision making about where your money goes.
A follow-up question for that. How often do you recalculate your net worth? Is that something you guys do on like a monthly, quarterly, annual basis? What does
Yeah,
that look like?
quarterly. Quarterly. Yeah.
We do the same, but you're so wise. I was like, if she does it differently, maybe I should. And
Yeah.
then
I don't want to get in there and mess around with it too much. But yeah, quarterly for sure.
yeah, that's what we do. And
Yeah.
next question, what is your go-to tool for managing your operations?
Yeah, so Excel spreadsheet for the net worth statement. And then, other people may differ on this, but I'm a big fan of having a lot of things consolidated. So I just mentioned probably we have a lot of accounts, right? We have our investments, we have our retirement accounts, we have sinking fund accounts, we have tax holdbacks. Like we have all these different operating accounts. And I use Fidelity Investments for all of that. I know a lot of people will use different institutions for their banking and their investing and their high yield savings and all of that. I find it's so much easier to manage a system when I have one primary institution. And the one thing that I think has helped us, the only external account that we really use outside of Fidelity Investments is a joint bank account that I mentioned where our mortgage and our insurances and daycare and all of that stuff comes from, because then it's a separate login and I'm not looking at it every single day and it doesn't really commingle with our investments. So having that joint operating account be separate is helpful, but vast majority, 98% of our accounts are held at one institution at Fidelity.
That is great wisdom. And then finally, what is a book that has been transformational in your investing journey?
Yeah, so The Hands-Off Investor by Brian Burke, that was an amazing book to help me with the operator and the private equity funds. The Who Not How book, that was awesome. I really, really enjoyed early on in my career. I read The Slight Edge, which was just kind of an amazing book on getting 1% better every day and just focusing on those little things. So The Slight Edge was awesome. And then the last one that I really, really enjoyed was The Lifestyle Investor by Justin Donald.
You're such an overachiever. You give us 4. I love it.
There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then finally, Ali, if somebody really resonated with you on this podcast, if they'd like to connect with you, ask a follow-up question, or maybe they're looking for somebody to be a private money lender to them, what's the best way for someone to reach you?
Yeah, you can find me on most socials, LinkedIn, all of those things. So be happy to answer any questions.
All right, and we'll have the links to those in the show notes down below for everybody. Well, thank you so much, Ali. I appreciate your time. That is a wrap on today's episode of the Freedom Blueprint. If you got value from this conversation, do me a favor and go ahead and subscribe wherever you're listening. Leave a review if you've got a minute, and most importantly, share it with a fellow investor who could learn from Ali's journey. Remember, real estate isn't just about properties, it's about building a life of freedom like Ali is doing here. See you next time.